June 1945. Okinawa. Dawn spreads a pale light over the dense, mist-laden jungle. The air is thick with humidity, and the scent of salt from the nearby sea. Japanese infantry, faces streaked with mud and sweat, advance cautiously along narrow paths, their rifles cradled against their shoulders. The quiet is deceptive. Then it begins. A low, thunderous roar builds in the distance. At first, the soldiers freeze, unsure if it's artillery, aircraft, or some monstrous new weapon. Suddenly, streaks of fire erupt from the American lines. Dozens of rockets launching in unison, leaving trails of smoke that twist across the sky. Explosions tear through foliage and bunkers, hurling earth and debris into the air. Japanese soldiers huddle, disoriented, some shouting warnings, others frozen in disbelief. The jungle, once their cover, now feels like an oven of fire and sound. Each salvo changes the landscape, obliterates entrenched positions, and shatters their sense of control. This was not just artillery. It was the thunder of American ingenuity, a weapon that turned the night to day and left Japanese infantry questioning if anything could withstand it. The shock of these rocket salvos would set the stage for a new kind of warfare, one that by early 1945, the Pacific War had entered its most brutal phase. Japan, once a dominant maritime power in East Asia, was increasingly on the defensive. Its vast empire, stretching from Korea to the Philippines and deep into Southeast Asia, was crumbling under relentless Allied pressure. The American strategy was methodical. Island by island, push closer to the Japanese home islands, isolating strongholds, cutting supply lines, and softening defenses before a full-scale invasion could occur. Okinawa, a lush island just 350 miles from mainland Japan, became a pivotal objective. Its capture promised a staging ground for an eventual assault on Kyushu, the southernmost of the home islands. For the Japanese, it was more than strategic. It was symbolic. Losing Okinawa would expose the heart of their homeland to direct attack. Defending it meant mobilizing every available soldier, including poorly trained conscripts, seasoned veterans, and even labor units pressed into combat. The terrain favored the defenders. Okinawa's hills, dense jungles, and intricate cave systems allowed Japanese forces to construct hidden bunkers, fortified positions, and concealed artillery sites. The Americans, despite overwhelming naval and air superiority, faced an enemy who had mastered the art of ambush, camouflage, and attritional warfare. Intelligence reports from early May indicated that Japanese forces were well entrenched, prepared to resist at nearly every point of contact, and likely to exploit the terrain to inflict maximum casualties. The American response was equally methodical. The U.S. 10th Army, under Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., began assembling a massive force, over 180,000 troops, supported by artillery, armor, naval gunfire, and air power. One of the innovations brought to Okinawa was the use of rocket artillery. Unlike traditional howitzers, rocket launchers could deliver devastating barrages rapidly and over wide areas, saturating enemy positions in seconds. The psychological effect was nearly as significant as the physical destruction. The roar, flash, and shock of dozens of rockets launched simultaneously disrupted even well-trained troops. The 90mm and 75mm Peking rockets, often fired from M8 bazooka variants and specialized ground launchers, were designed to complement the heavy artillery and naval gunfire already in play. Their mobility allowed forward units to adjust positions quickly, striking entrenched defenders who believed they were safe behind hills or inside caves. By early June, American forces had already conducted several test bombardments on smaller Japanese positions. The reports were clear. Rocket artillery was not just a tool, it was a weapon that could unsettle even the most disciplined units. On the Japanese side, the adaptation to American firepower was uneven. Officers, many hardened by years of combat in China and the Philippines, understood conventional artillery and air raids. But rocket artillery, with its sudden eruptions of sound and fire, introduced a chaotic element that existing training did not prepare them for. Early encounters showed a consistent pattern. Japanese infantry units often misjudged the timing and impact of rocket barrages, underestimating their speed and lethality. By June the 1st, forward elements of the U.S. 10th Army had landed on Okinawa's western beaches. The initial advance was met with sharp resistance, machine gun nests, sniper fire, and hidden anti-tank positions. Yet, in areas where rocket artillery was employed, defenders found themselves pinned down by unpredictable, overwhelming firepower. Japanese units attempted counterattacks, moving from bunker to bunker, but the sudden eruptions of rockets made movement a gamble. Casualties mounted, morale faltered, and confusion spread among the ranks. The strategic stakes were immense. Okinawa was not just another battle. It was a microcosm of what Japan faced in the final months of the war. Every hill captured, every defensive line shattered, brought the Allies closer to a direct strike on the home islands. For the Americans, mastering the coordination of artillery, armor, and infantry was essential. For the Japanese, surviving the storm of fire and maintaining cohesion under relentless assault became a test of discipline, courage, and ingenuity. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define the effectiveness of new technology in modern warfare. Rocket artillery, once an experimental concept, would now demonstrate its true power, not merely in destruction, but in its ability to instill fear, disorient defenders, and transform the battlefield into a theater of chaos and light. Demanded adaptation, courage, and survival. The first weeks of June 1945 revealed the full complexity of Okinawa's battlefields. Japanese defenders, under the command of Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima and his Chief of Staff, General Isamu Cho, had prepared intricate networks of caves, tunnels, and pillboxes. These fortifications were designed to absorb artillery strikes, allowing infantry to counterattack once the bombardment ceased. In many sectors, tunnels ran for hundreds of meters beneath the hills, interconnecting multiple positions. For the Japanese, this was a lifeline. For the Americans, it posed a deadly puzzle. American forces faced an environment where traditional bombardment often failed to neutralize the enemy. Early attempts to reduce cave positions with standard 105 mm and 155 mm artillery were partially effective. But the Japanese would re-emerge, regroup, and continue resistance. Forward observers quickly recognized that rocket artillery, with its high volume and shock effect, could complement these efforts. Its sudden eruptions of flame, noise, and concussive force penetrated positions that conventional shells sometimes could not. The psychological dimension of rocket fire was profound. Japanese soldiers, accustomed to the predictable rhythm of artillery barrages, found the new weapon unnerving. Unlike conventional guns, rockets produced blinding flashes and thunderous booms, often striking multiple positions simultaneously. Units reporting back from the front lines described the sensation as the ground itself erupting. Officers found it increasingly difficult to coordinate defense under such disorienting conditions. Soldiers hesitated in movement, fearing where the next salvo might land. In addition to forward observers and artillery coordination teams, U.S. commanders employed specialized units trained to deploy rocket launchers in concealed positions. These teams could quickly relocate, providing coverage for advancing infantry and armor. Mobility, speed, and surprise became the hallmarks of this tactic. In contrast, Japanese defensive doctrine emphasized static positions and carefully prepared fields of fire. The clash of approaches, dynamic rocket assault versus fixed bunker defense, would define much of the ensuing fighting. By mid-June, Reports from Okinawa indicated that rocket artillery had become one of the most feared American tools. In one sector, Japanese officers noted that repeated rocket barrages forced infantry to abandon positions they had believed impregnable. Units that survived the initial strikes often became disorganized, unable to mount coordinated counterattacks. Casualty rates climbed sharply, particularly among frontline infantry tasked with holding terrain against combined artillery and infantry assaults. Meanwhile, the Americans continued to integrate rocket fire into broader operations. Naval gunfire, airstrikes, and tank units all worked in concert with the rockets, producing a layered effect. Japanese units that had survived repeated shelling found themselves facing sudden mobile barrages that disrupted communication lines and supply routes. The combination of unpredictability and destructive force proved particularly effective in breaking entrenched defenses. The Japanese command, realizing the growing impact of American rocket artillery, attempted countermeasures. Sniper teams, mortars, and limited counter-battery fire were deployed, but these efforts were often too late. By the time they could react, U.S. forces had already moved forward or shifted fire to new targets. Rocket artillery's psychological impact compounded the tactical advantage. Defenders hesitated, anticipating sudden, overwhelming strikes that could erupt at any moment. By late June, the stage was set for some of the most intense confrontations on Okinawa. Japanese defenders had shown resilience, courage, and adaptability under fire, but the emergence of rocket artillery had introduced a new variable. It was no longer enough to dig in, camouflage positions, and prepare for conventional barrages. The battlefield had become unpredictable, a chaotic interplay of fire, sound, and motion. Soldiers on both sides were acutely aware that technology could now dictate the rhythm of combat. This evolving battlefield environment underscored a critical reality. Okinawa was more than a struggle for terrain. It had become a test of adaptation, of morale under relentless assault, and of the human capacity to endure in the face of unprecedented firepower. Rocket artillery, once a minor experimental tool, was proving its strategic and psychological potency, shaping the final chapters of Japan's defensive effort. The Americans, confident in the synergy of rockets, artillery, infantry, and armor, prepared to press forward into the next phase of the battle. Japanese commanders, despite extraordinary skill and determination, faced a growing challenge that would push their forces to the brink. The coming days would demonstrate the full consequences of introducing a weapon that could strike fast, strike hard, and strike fear itself. For the Japanese infantry, the introduction of American rocket artillery was more than a tactical evolution. It was a psychological shock. Soldiers who had endured months of artillery barrages and frontal assaults suddenly faced a weapon that arrived without warning, its impact deafening, its flame blinding. Accounts from surviving officers describe the moment rockets first landed near entrenched positions. It was as if the mountain itself was tearing open, one noted. Fear spread rapidly among the men. Units trained to hold their ground began hesitating, uncertain whether their dugouts would survive the next eruption. Morale, already strained by shortages of supplies and mounting casualties, became fragile. Despite this fear, human resilience remained. Some Japanese soldiers adapted quickly, moving between tunnels, using smoke and camouflage to mitigate the psychological effect of sudden blasts. Officers worked tirelessly to maintain cohesion, issuing orders with a calmness that belied the chaos around them. Yet, the unpredictability of rocket strikes, sometimes multiple salvos landing simultaneously, created an environment where even disciplined troops found themselves frozen, waiting for the next inferno to strike. The human element of battle, panic, courage, hesitation, was now magnified by a weapon designed to disrupt precisely these instincts. From a tactical perspective, rocket artillery altered the calculus of the battlefield. Japanese defensive doctrine relied heavily on prepared positions, pillboxes, bunkers, and interconnected caves. These fortifications, often impervious to small arms or single-shell attacks, were designed to absorb enemy fire and allow counterattacks. Rocket artillery, however, offered a solution to a problem that had long frustrated American commanders. Its ability to saturate a sector rapidly, striking multiple targets within seconds, neutralized static defenses. Forward observers directed salvos with precision, often targeting choke points, entrances to caves, and exposed firing positions. The tactic was simple but devastating: force defenders out of cover, disrupt coordination, and create openings for infantry and armor to advance. Rocket teams could reposition quickly, exploiting weaknesses revealed during earlier barrages. In effect, the weapon turned previously safe defensive positions into death traps. The tactical advantage was clear: mobility, volume of fire, and shock effect combined to challenge even the most carefully prepared Japanese lines. Rocket artillery represented a technological leap in mid-20th century warfare. Unlike conventional artillery, which relied on predictable parabolic trajectories and slower firing rates, rockets delivered rapid, concentrated, and visually overwhelming strikes. The M8 and M16 launchers, mounted on versatile vehicles, allowed for mobility and flexibility in deployment. Their psychological effect was amplified by physical properties: the roar of engines, the flash of the exhaust, and the concussive shock that could rattle fortifications. American engineers and tacticians understood that the weapon's effectiveness was as much psychological as physical. Rockets could create chaos without needing pinpoint accuracy. A single salvo could force defenders to abandon multiple positions simultaneously. This dual purpose, damage and intimidation, was a hallmark of technological innovation applied to the battlefield. For Japanese soldiers, there was no historical precedent. Traditional artillery could be endured, but rockets were unpredictable, sudden, and terrifying. Leadership on both sides was tested like never before. American officers coordinated rocket teams alongside infantry and artillery, ensuring maximum coverage and timing with assaults. They had to anticipate Japanese reactions, shifting fire to break counterattacks and protect advancing troops. The ability to integrate technology into operational planning became a defining skill. On the Japanese side, commanders faced the unenviable task of maintaining discipline under conditions they had not anticipated. Decisions had to be made rapidly, whether to hold a position, retreat into deeper tunnels, or counterattack. Leaders who hesitated risked their men being cut down by successive rocket salvos. Many officers wrote in reports about the disorienting effect rockets had on communications, morale, and cohesion, noting that the weapon's mere presence demanded adaptation in leadership style. The convergence of human fear, tactical innovation, technological shock, and leadership challenges set the stage for a battlefield transformed. Japanese infantry were facing a weapon that defied their experience, while American forces were learning to exploit both its destructive and psychological power. From the Japanese perspective, American rocket artillery was both bewildering and terrifying. Frontline soldiers described the sudden eruptions of fire and smoke as heaven-sent destruction and the wrath of the skies. Reports from field officers reveal a mix of awe and panic. They recognized the artillery's destructive capability but struggled to comprehend its speed and unpredictability. Unlike traditional bombardments, which allowed time to adjust and counter, rockets arrived almost instantaneously, scattering units and leaving little opportunity for organized defense. Japanese engineers attempted to respond. Reinforced bunkers, deeper trench systems, and camouflage were employed to mitigate damage. Patrols and reconnaissance were intensified to detect the movement of rocket launchers. However, these measures often proved insufficient. The mobility of American rocket teams allowed them to strike, withdraw, and relocate before Japanese forces could mount a coordinated response. This created a sense of constant vulnerability, eroding confidence and increasing stress on the troops. The psychological edge gained by the Americans was as significant as any physical destruction. The use of rocket artillery also raised questions about moral implications and psychological warfare. Soldiers witnessing entire sections of the battlefield erupt in flame and debris faced trauma that lingered long after the conflict. Contemporary reports from American medics and war correspondents noted that Japanese troops often displayed signs of acute stress and disorientation following rocket barrages. The ethical dimension lay in the weapon's design. It did not discriminate between combatants in fortified positions. It was intended to shock, overwhelm, and destabilize human minds as much as to destroy materiel. On the American side, commanders justified the weapon's use as a necessary tool to reduce casualties among their infantry. By forcing defenders out of cover, rockets minimized the need for costly frontal assaults. Yet the psychological burden on both sides was undeniable. Veterans recalled the sound of whistling rockets, the smell of scorched earth, and the instantaneous devastation as formative. Unforgettable experiences that defined their view of war. Rocket artillery was not a standalone solution. It was most effective when integrated into a larger combined arms strategy. American units synchronized rocket salvos with infantry advances, armor breakthroughs, and traditional artillery barrages. This coordination amplified both destructive and psychological effects. Infantry could move in under the cover of rockets, encountering fewer entrenched defenders. Tanks supported by rocket barrages faced less concentrated resistance, allowing breakthroughs in heavily fortified positions. Japanese forces quickly realized the challenge posed by this integration. Counterattacks were often disrupted by simultaneous rocket strikes, and communication lines were severed by both physical destruction and the chaos of the battlefield. The Americans' ability to combine mobility, firepower, and timing turned what might have been a single tactical advantage into an operational one, influencing entire campaigns and shaping the approach to Pacific Island warfare. At the strategic level, rocket artillery contributed to a broader American effort to regain momentum in the Pacific. Early in the war, Japanese forces had established dominance through entrenched positions and superior knowledge of the terrain. Rocket artillery, along with naval and aerial support, allowed U.S. commanders to challenge this dominance directly. It disrupted supply lines, forced repositioning of Japanese units, and enabled amphibious assaults with reduced casualties. The cumulative effect of this technology, when applied strategically, reshaped the battlefield. Japanese commanders were forced to reconsider their defensive doctrines, while American forces gained confidence in combining technological innovation with tactical planning. Rocket artillery demonstrated that a relatively small but highly mobile and psychologically impactful weapon could change operational dynamics, influencing decisions at the highest levels of command. The introduction of American rocket artillery in the Pacific theater was more than a technological novelty. It tested human endurance, challenged established defensive tactics, reshaped leadership approaches, and forced a recalibration of enemy strategies. From the trenches to the command posts, from the individual soldier to the theater commander, the weapon left an indelible mark. The battlefield, once dominated by predictable artillery and entrenched positions, had been transformed into an unpredictable and terrifying space. This convergence of human, tactical, technological, leadership, enemy, morale, and strategic angles set the stage for the decisive confrontations to come. October 1944. Leyte Gulf, the Philippines. The humid air carried the metallic scent of salt and oil. American forces had already begun their push inland, but Japanese defenses remained formidable. In the hills and mangroves, Japanese infantry clung to their positions, confident that terrain and trenches would blunt the advancing Allies. At first light, U.S. Army engineers deployed the new M8 bazooka rocket artillery units alongside traditional infantry battalions. From concealed positions on ridgelines, the launchers were aimed toward the dense enemy positions below. The first salvo tore through the morning silence. Whistling through the air, rockets slammed into bunkers and foxholes. The explosions were deafening, shaking the ground beneath both sides. Soldiers on both sides were momentarily frozen, not from fear alone, but from the sheer surreal violence of what was happening. Japanese officers, accustomed to conventional artillery, were stunned. Their maps, calculations, and experience could not account for the speed and impact of rocket barrages. Foxholes that had withstood shelling for days were obliterated in seconds. Entire squads were thrown from their positions, disoriented and disorganized. Reports from the front lines described men diving into shallow trenches, only to find their protection gone. Smoke and debris hung thick in the tropical air, obscuring sight lines, confusing targets, and shattering command cohesion. American infantry, trained to exploit these bursts, moved forward with precision. Tanks rolled in behind rocket barrages, their steel hulls providing both cover and firepower. Engineers followed, clearing obstacles and booby traps that Japanese forces had hastily constructed. The synchronized assault demonstrated the culmination of months of planning and innovation. A mobile, flexible, and psychologically overwhelming force. The turning point became undeniable as Japanese resistance faltered. Attempts to mount counterattacks were met with the same devastating rocket barrages. Communication lines were cut. Attempts to regroup or reinforce positions were intercepted or destroyed. By midday, several key positions that had been thought impregnable were abandoned. Survivors reported a sense of helplessness, as if the battlefield itself had turned against them. One particularly significant engagement occurred near the Ormoc River. American rocket artillery teams, positioned on elevated terrain, unleashed a sustained barrage against Japanese bunkers and machine gun nests. 3 consecutive salvos penetrated reinforced positions, neutralizing the defenders before they could respond effectively. Infantry followed, encountering minimal resistance as Japanese troops fled or surrendered. This moment marked more than a tactical victory. It was psychological domination. Japanese officers admitted later, in diaries and reports captured after the war, that they had never imagined an enemy weapon capable of such sudden, precise, and sustained destruction. Their doctrine of defense, built on concealment, discipline, and terrain advantage, had been shattered. The battlefield was no longer predictable. The psychological weight of American rocket artillery forced a re-evaluation of every defensive strategy across the theater. By evening, the coastline had shifted. Positions once fortified with years of preparation lay in ruins. Smoke rose from destroyed bunkers, mingling with the humid mist of the jungle. Survivors of the Japanese forces moved silently through the wreckage, aware that the tides had turned. On the American side, troops consolidated their gains, exhausted but emboldened by the effectiveness of their new weaponry. The decisive moment on Leyte exemplified the broader implications of rocket artillery. It demonstrated that speed, surprise, and psychological impact could redefine battlefield dynamics. What had begun as a technological experiment had become a force multiplier, capable of changing the course of engagements and reshaping the approach to Pacific warfare. This victory set the stage for the next series of confrontations, where American forces would continue to leverage rocket artillery to break Japanese defenses and reclaim territory. November 1944. The mountains and jungles of Leyte had become a crucible. Japanese forces, though battered, had retreated to secondary defensive lines. Yet the fear planted by the first encounters with American rocket artillery lingered. Commanders on both sides understood that the next engagement would decide not just territory, but morale. American rocket units were no longer experimental. They were fully integrated into combined arms operations. Infantry, tanks, engineers, and artillery worked in seamless coordination. Reconnaissance teams had pinpointed Japanese positions, and rockets now became the spearhead of every assault. The first rocket from a concealed hilltop would explode a machine gun nest. The next would send smoke and debris into nearby foxholes, leaving defenders exposed. Japanese officers scrambled to adapt. They attempted to dig deeper, reinforce positions, and disperse forces. But every strategy was met with the relentless reach of rockets. Reports describe entire platoons immobilized, not just physically, but mentally, unable to comprehend a weapon that could strike without warning, without the telltale whine of traditional artillery shells. The battlefield had become unpredictable. One notable engagement occurred near Kananga, a strategic junction along Leyte's western coast. U.S. infantry advanced cautiously, aware that Japanese troops might attempt ambushes. Suddenly, rockets arced through the sky, striking entrenched positions with terrifying precision. Japanese officers radioed desperate requests for reinforcements, only to find the roads clogged with debris from previous barrages. The psychological impact was profound. Survivors later recounted a sensation of being hunted by an invisible force. Unlike conventional artillery, which could be heard or tracked, rocket artillery moved silently, striking with no warning. Entire companies surrendered after witnessing repeated barrages obliterate defensive lines. Small pockets of resistance attempted last-ditch counterattacks, but they were scattered before reaching American positions. The cumulative effect of rocket artillery on the battlefield forced a strategic reconsideration. Japanese commanders began diverting forces to secondary areas, fearing repeated rocket strikes. Supply lines were cut. Communications became erratic. What had once been a cohesive defensive network disintegrated under the weight of technological and tactical superiority. By mid-November, Leyte's western coast was effectively under American control. The destruction was both physical and psychological. Bunkers and trenches were leveled. Entire units had surrendered or been neutralized. American troops, though exhausted, moved with confidence, their morale bolstered by the devastating efficiency of rocket artillery. This climax did more than clear territory. It reshaped expectations of combat in the Pacific theater. The Japanese infantry, trained and disciplined in conventional defensive warfare, now faced a reality where technology and tactical innovation could render their experience and preparation ineffective. The M8 rocket launchers had not just destroyed positions, they had rewritten the rules of engagement. The decisive moment of Leyte demonstrated a critical lesson. Success on the battlefield was no longer purely about numbers or terrain. Precision, speed, and psychological impact could determine outcomes faster than traditional engagements. American forces recognized this, integrating rocket artillery into subsequent operations across Leyte and later in the Philippines, setting the stage for the final pushes toward Luzon and the eventual approach to Japan itself. By the end of November, the islands bore the scars of battle. Smoke still rose from shattered positions. Troops walked through jungles scarred by fire and explosions. Survivors of the Japanese infantry moved cautiously, haunted by what they had witnessed. The battlefield had been transformed, and with it, the understanding of modern warfare in the Pacific had irrevocably shifted. The story of Leyte and the rise of rocket artillery was more than a tactical victory. It was a harbinger of how innovation, speed, and psychological dominance could redefine conflict. The aftermath would reveal both the human cost and the strategic advantage of these decisive actions. December 1944. Leyte lay in ruins. The once dense jungles were scarred with craters and blackened tree trunks, a testament to the relentless power of American rocket artillery. Villages had been evacuated or destroyed. Roads were impassable, littered with debris from collapsed bunkers and shattered vehicles. For the Japanese infantry, the battlefield had become unrecognizable, a nightmarish terrain where survival often seemed a matter of luck rather than skill. Reports from both sides highlighted the psychological toll. American soldiers spoke of the eerie quiet that preceded a barrage, the sudden, terrifying roar of rockets, and the ground trembling beneath their feet. Japanese survivors described an invisible force raining destruction from a distance, stripping away any sense of control. Officers admitted that training and experience counted for little when faced with an enemy who could strike suddenly. With devastating precision, the material losses were significant. U.S. after-action reports estimated that dozens of Japanese positions had been obliterated in single strikes. Entire platoons were neutralized without direct engagement. Bunkers, dugouts, and defensive lines were rendered ineffective, forcing Japanese forces to abandon previously fortified areas. This accelerated the collapse of resistance across key sections of the island. American forces, meanwhile, consolidated their gains. Rocket artillery units moved quickly to support infantry advances, clearing pockets of resistance and preventing Japanese counterattacks. Supply lines, though stretched, were maintained with efficiency, ensuring that rocket launchers and ammunition remained available at critical junctures. Commanders documented the effectiveness of combined arms operations, praising the synergy between infantry, armor, and rocket units. The aftermath also revealed a stark disparity in morale. American troops, emboldened by the visible and psychological impact of rockets, gained confidence in subsequent operations. Japanese infantry, however, suffered a collapse in cohesion. Reports noted increased desertions, surrenders, and instances of units retreating without engagement. For many, the mere presence of rocket artillery became a deterrent, reshaping Japanese tactical calculations. Strategically, the effects extended beyond Leyte. The demonstrated efficiency of rocket artillery influenced subsequent American operations across the Philippines. Commanders incorporated rocket units as standard in assaults, understanding their dual role, inflicting physical destruction and breaking the enemy's will to fight. Intelligence reports emphasized that Japanese forces were adjusting defensive strategies, often attempting to disperse units or retreat to less vulnerable terrain. However, by this stage of the war, options were limited, and the momentum firmly favored Allied forces. On the ground, individual stories illustrated the human cost. Survivors recounted units wiped out while attempting to hold key positions, families displaced, and the harrowing experience of living under the constant threat of invisible, explosive strikes. American medics reported treating dozens of soldiers suffering from shock and trauma, symptoms induced less by direct injuries than by the terror of rocket barrages. Ultimately, the aftermath of Leyte underscored a transformation in warfare. Rocket artillery had not only destroyed enemy positions, it had shattered the conventional understanding of infantry engagement in the Pacific. The battlefield was now a place where technology could preempt strategy, where fear could be as potent a weapon as bullets or bayonets. This evolution set the stage for the final campaigns of 1945, where the lessons of Leyte would be applied across Luzon, Okinawa, and the broader push toward Japan itself. The combination of psychological impact, material destruction, and strategic leverage marked a turning point in Pacific operations, redefining the possibilities of modern combat. By early 1945, the echoes of Leyte's rocket barrages were still felt across the Pacific theater. The Japanese command, once confident in the resilience of its infantry, faced a new reality. American firepower had evolved beyond conventional artillery and small arms. Rocket artillery had demonstrated that massed infantry attacks, even when well-trained and disciplined, could be neutralized before engagement. Communications intercepted by Allied intelligence revealed growing concern among Japanese officers, who increasingly feared that no defensive arrangement could withstand the sudden, concentrated devastation. On the ground, soldiers faced lingering consequences. Entire Japanese battalions had been decimated, leaving gaps in defensive lines. Survivors reported a pervasive sense of futility. Trenches and bunkers offered little protection against rockets that could strike from a kilometer away. Morale eroded further as supply shortages and isolation compounded the fear of another sudden, devastating strike. Letters from frontline officers described sleepless nights and the desperate improvisation of defensive positions, often in terrain too exposed to provide safety. American units, in contrast, began refining their use of rocket artillery. Reports detailed coordinated attacks where infantry advanced immediately following barrages, taking advantage of disoriented and scattered Japanese forces. Field commanders noted that rocket units allowed for unprecedented flexibility. They could deliver rapid, concentrated firepower at multiple targets simultaneously, enabling faster advances and minimizing casualties. For the first time in the Pacific, a system allowed infantry to engage the enemy under conditions of near-total suppression, reducing direct combat risk. The material toll was staggering. Photographs taken after assaults showed entire villages leveled, defensive bunkers reduced to rubble, and terrain scarred by repeated impacts. Analysts later noted that the rockets, though less accurate than conventional artillery, compensated with saturation and shock effect. Japanese forces, unable to repair or relocate positions quickly, found themselves perpetually reacting rather than controlling the battlefield. Psychologically, the impact was even more profound. American war correspondents wrote of Japanese troops exhibiting signs of acute stress, a visible decline in combat cohesion, and increasing numbers of premature withdrawals from fortified positions. Soldiers described the constant thunderous roar of incoming rockets as a force that stripped away courage, leaving only fear. Commanders' reports confirmed that even elite units, previously thought invincible in jungle warfare, were vulnerable to the new technology. The consequences reached beyond tactics and battlefield outcomes. Strategically, the U.S. Army recognized that rocket artillery had shifted the balance in favor of mobility and combined arms. Japanese defensive doctrine, heavily reliant on fortified positions and attritional tactics, was proving obsolete. Lessons from Leyte informed subsequent amphibious landings and island-hopping campaigns, emphasizing the integration of firepower, air support, and infantry maneuvers. By mid-1945, the broader effect of rocket artillery was evident in Okinawa and the Philippines. Japanese forces increasingly dispersed, abandoning traditional strongpoints. Intelligence reports noted that many soldiers refused to occupy positions previously targeted by rocket barrages, indicating a direct link between technological shock and battlefield psychology. In essence, the aftermath of Leyte demonstrated a dual legacy. On one hand, it illustrated the devastating physical power of American rocket artillery. On the other, it revealed its psychological potency, the ability to disrupt, demoralize, and outmaneuver a determined enemy before conventional combat even began. These lessons would echo through the final months of the Pacific War, defining not just victories, but the nature of modern warfare itself. The stage was now set for reflection, examining how a single technological innovation reshaped strategy, human endurance, and the course of history. In the quiet that followed the storm of rockets, the battlefield spoke volumes. Scorched earth, shattered bunkers, and the silent remnants of once determined infantry lines bore witness to a transformation in warfare. Rocket artillery was more than a weapon. It was a force that reshaped how battles were fought and how soldiers understood survival. Where courage and discipline had once dictated outcomes, now technology could seize the initiative, striking fear as effectively as it struck flesh and stone. The psychological dimension was profound. Japanese infantry, trained to endure, to fight relentlessly, found themselves vulnerable in ways they had never anticipated. The deafening roar of the rocket, the sudden flare across the jungle canopy, and the aftermath of destruction created an environment where hesitation replaced boldness and caution supplanted aggression. The human cost extended beyond casualties. It seeped into the minds of those who survived, altering their approach to combat, command, and survival itself. From a strategic perspective, Rocket artillery accelerated the evolution of combined arms doctrine. Infantry could advance under a protective curtain of concentrated fire. Armored units and aircraft could exploit the chaos created by the blasts. Battles became orchestrations of multiple synchronized elements rather than isolated engagements. Leyte demonstrated that technological innovation could redefine the balance between offense and defense, between initiative and reaction. Yet, beyond tactics and strategy, there was a deeper lesson. Warfare is not only measured in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in how humans respond to the unprecedented. The rocket's fire illuminated both the ingenuity and fragility of soldiers. It reminded commanders and historians alike that every new weapon reshapes not just the battlefield, but the very psychology of those who wield it and those who face it. Leyte, in this sense, stands as a testament to the dual nature of war: creation and destruction, courage and fear, adaptation and consequence. The roar of American rockets silenced resistance, but it also spoke to the inexorable march of military innovation, an echo that would reverberate far beyond the jungles of the Philippines, shaping the future of warfare and reminding humanity of the profound impact technology can have on the human spirit. This marked the end of one chapter in the Pacific War. But the lessons of rocket artillery and the shock it brought to Japanese infantry would resonate in military history for decades to come.